Hi film students, how are you? Professor Bryant here. All right, so this particular unit is about classical films. Going back, we're going to talk about the 30s, the 40s, that period of movie. I know, when most of you think old movies, you're thinking 80s, right? You're thinking 1980s. No. We're going to go farther back into the actual classic, what is known as the classic period of Hollywood filmmaking. Nickelodeon, the TV network, got their idea for the name based on what the early theaters were. The very first theaters were called Nickelodeons. They cost a nickel. They were dark, they were hot, they were not well ventilated, but because they were a nickel, they were accessible to everyone. You didn't have to be a millionaire to get to see a movie. So this became an entertainment that was popular for the masses. And the films were just short, black and white, silent films. Before we had the Nickelodeons that were built in basically empty stores, kind of like you see maybe now at a strip mall where someone's out of business. Before that you had mutoscopes and kinetoscopes. These were machines that maybe you cranked and the pictures spun, and so that happened, and then Nickelodeons happened, and then we started getting to full-blown the grand movie palaces of the 1920s and 1930s. So the first film studio was in Hollywood, and it was opened in 1909. It's the Selig Polyscope Company. They paved the way for Universal, Paramount, and Warner Brothers. So here's what happened. Thomas Edison essentially gets credited for inventing movies. He kind of didn't really invent them. When that happens, you know, where something gets invented, but it turns out 20 different people were working on it at the same time. That's kind of what happened. Thomas Edison was the one who patented it, though. He's the one who invented it and then sort of put a corner on the market. He held the patent to all of the technology in New York. So when movies were being made, they were being made in New York. There were filmmakers who got frustrated with Thomas Edison and with the control that he had. Edison liked for everything to be very realistic, so very often an Edison film, you can go back and see one called The Kiss. It's available on YouTube, and it really is just two people sitting in front of a camera, straight on. Everything was straight on, unless you're the Lumiere brothers and you decide to put it at an angle. So we've got a camera straight on, and a couple basically just, they like kiss and kind of giggle and kiss and kind of giggle, right? So Edison is all about capturing real moments in a sort of scientific way with the camera. There are people who have the idea and the desire to work narratively, to work story, to work artistically, and they're chafing under Edison's control of the patent in New York City. So they go to Los Angeles, they go to California, as far from Edison as you can get and still be in the United States. Here they have the freedom to make the movies, to make the art the way they want to. Not only do they have the freedom, they also have the weather, because in Los Angeles you just don't get rain, unlike over on the East Coast. So you can pretty well count on good sunlight for movie making to happen. You've also got nearby mountains, desert, ocean, all the different scenarios that you might need to make your movie. Sunlight, scenarios, and freedom. That is why Los Angeles is actually the seat of movie making. So in the early cinema, you've got Edison, who's first projecting and doing screened moving pictures starting as early as 1896. He monopolizes it, forming the Motion Pictures Patent Company. And then you have your independents who work outside the MPCC, like Edwin S. Porter, D.W. Griffith, Max Sennett, and their films engaged the aspects of the rapidly changing cultures. Porter is making story films. Griffith is making Victorian melodramas, and he's kind of known as the first auteur director, and we'll talk about Griffith in a minute. And then Max Sennett is making knockabout comedy type movies. Griffith is problematic. He's infamous. You know, and infamous is like when you're famous, but really not necessarily in a good way. He's infamous because he's hugely important in moving forward the craft of filmmaking in the 1920s, 1919s or 19 teens and 20s. He's important. He's an auteur. He's an artist. That said, he's also guilty of making The Birth of the Nation, which is widely considered to be hugely correctly racist. It has some terrible portrayals of African Americans, idolizes the Ku Klux Klan. Nonetheless, that film aside, subject matter aside, he is important as far as moving forward the technology and the craft of filmmaking. 1914 is when you start to see the very first what we call feature films. These are films that are longer and that have an actual story, a beginning, middle, and end. 1896 to 1914, it's really just short little slices of life, just little moments of, hey, we're feeding the baby, hey, we're kissing. And then in 1914, they start giving the film a form, a clear story form like you might see in a book or in a play. Beginning, middle, end, characters, a problem that must be solved, obstacles that get in the way of the problem that must be solved. You've got your heroes and your villains. That all starts in 1914. The productions start to get more sophisticated as they start to figure out things they can do with the camera that they didn't know they could do, editing and lighting and special effects, things like this. You start to have a range of genres. You have comedies, you have westerns, you have romances, you have scary horror movies. All of those things start happening in 1914 and really go right through 1928, still without sound, only with perhaps piano or organ music being played live at the theater while the movie happens. Any dialogue is being mouthed and lip read, or if it's really important and they know that the audience needs the dialogue, they're going to put it on an intertitle card to be sure that you absolutely get the words that you need. Otherwise, you're mostly just following the actions of the story and trying to read the lips. Directors at this time, D.W. Griffith, Cecil B. DeMille, who's doing great big stage melodrama pieces. Thomas Ince is doing westerns. And then you have Charlie Chaplin, who a lot of us even now still have heard of. He's the guy that you see with the little buns on his fork, and he does this. He's got the little mustache. That's Charlie Chaplin. And then Buster Keaton doing comedy work. And as I referred to in the first lesson, this is a period where women are doing a lot of really great work. You have writers, screenwriters winning Oscars, female screenwriters winning Oscars in this time period. You won't have that again for, 80, 90 years. So it's really fascinating to me that at this time, the world of theater, or the world of film, really was wide open for these women who wanted to write these pieces. So you had June Mathis, Gina McPherson, Frances Marion, and Frances Marion wrote The Champ, which was remade in the 70s with Ricky Schroeder, but she won an Oscar for that. And then you have directors like Alice Guy Blanche and Lois Weber and Dorothy Arnzer, really famous female directors of the time period 1914 to 1928. But in 1928, sound is invented to go with the movies. Once that happens, it completely changes everything we know about movie making. At this point, once sound goes in, you start to have major dialogue in the scripts. Up to this point, they would keep the dialogue at a minimum because no one could hear the words. So in 1928, when you can start to hear the words, they start to add more words. And so scripts become really driven by dialogue. Musicals become popular for obvious reasons. Now you can hear the music that's happening. So you get these giant Busby Berkeley musicals with 100 women on stage dancing with feathers, and the camera is above their heads and they're doing all these crazy patterns. Or you get Esther Williams diving into pools, who knew, and doing all these crazy singing pool tricks. But musicals become really big starting in 1928. So you have Fred Astaire, you have Gene Kelly, you have all these really great, you have Judy Garland, all these really famous actors and these really famous stories that are driven by music because we can hear the music now. Or even if it's not a musical, you start to have music happening under the story, the underscore happening under the story. We're still having the genres of Western, gangster. Gangster movies start to be really popular here for obvious reasons. You're in the middle of, Chicago gangsters and Prohibition. And then you've got horror movies. Monster movies are really popular at this time. You've got Dracula, you've got Frankenstein, you've got the Phantom of the Opera, all these scary, scary movies. And you've got your romantic comedies. The hallmark of this period, though, 1928 to 1946, which is known as the classical Hollywood period, probably the key thing you have to take out of this period is the studio system. At this time, a studio owned everyone's contract. If you were owned by, say, Universal, you could only work for Universal. That went for actors, directors, wig makers, people who wrote the music, people who wrote the stories, people who taped the chords down. Didn't matter. Whatever it was that you did in the movie making process, you could only do it for that one studio. They owned you. And this system stays in place right through the 1946. It gives your studio heads absolute control, and it allows them to make the most money. They control every aspect of it. They own everyone, and they are the ones bringing home the bank. So that's called the studio system. Warner Brothers is known for gritty urban melodramas. They've got Humphrey Bogart, they've got James Cagney, they've got Edward G. Robinson. These are the good detective, black and white shadow kind of movies. MGM is known for musicals, so this is where Judy Garland is living. So you've got Judy Garland, you've got Busby Berkeley, you've got beautiful costumes and songs and dances. That's happening over at MGM. Studio directors are Ernst Lubitsch with Warner Brothers, Paramount, and MGM. He got to work with all three. You have John Ford, who's primarily known for westerns, but also actually very good at drama. But then you've got some indie directors too. Like even with the studio system and them owning all the contracts, there are people who refuse to work under the studio system. Frank Capra is one of those. He refused to work with the studio system. He's kind of known for his American libertarianism. A lot of his films have some sort of a political point of view, but patriotic in the sense they love America, but he is not going to bow down to any one particular authority or ideology. He makes what I think is the best Christmas movie of all time, which is It's a Wonderful Life. Orson Welles is another one. Is he back behind me? Is Orson Welles behind me? Okay. So Orson Welles is also a rogue director. A little bit less probably popular with the masses than Frank Capra. Orson Welles is a real artist with all of the quirks and ego that a true artist might be known to have. He really fought the studio system. He fought the studio executives. His work was very complex. Remember how I talked about complex films back in lesson 1, how you might have a movie that's got a knot and you've got to unknot it. That's Orson Welles. Citizen Kane, behind me, is known widely as the best film ever made in America. Many lists have it as the top film ever made. The American Film Institute, which is really a pretty legitimate source for film criticism, has it as their top film ever made. I don't like it, but what I can see is how important it is, because what Orson Welles was doing with Citizen Kane was he was pushing character development, he was pushing camera work like crazy. Some of the stuff he did in Citizen Kane had never been done before. Very strange angles and things that gave you a subconscious idea of what was going on with the characters, even though you weren't hearing what they were saying. But because he fought the studios so hard, A lot of times they would cut his work so that by the time it got out to the public, it didn't really work. It didn't make sense. They dummied it down. So the public didn't like it because they didn't understand it. But the reason they didn't understand it was because the executives had chopped it all to pieces. So only now have they been able to go back and take some of his work, put all the pieces back together so that the films are rich, they are complex, they are long, but they are quality and important, which in the AFI list of the top 100 films of all time, a great deal of what their criteria is just how important was the film in getting filmmaking moved forward. Orson Welles is really important there. Okay, so in your book, on page 252, you have the Hays Code, also known as the Production Code. This is what's happening also during the studio system. So here's the background of that. Basically, back in the 1920s, a bunch of Hollywood types, particularly actors and directors, were not behaving all that great. There was a lot of drugs, a lot of alcohol, a lot of sex. All these things are happening. It's having negative and adverse effect on how films are doing in the theaters. So all the producers get together and decide they're going to make a code of behavior called the Production Code. It was repealed in 1968. In 1968, they actually implemented the rating system that we know now, the GPGRX system that we know now. But this system is in place for 40 years up until that happens. And basically, it's a censorship policy. If you wanted to get your film made with a major studio and then put into a legitimate movie theater, you had to follow the code. I'll let you look at it, but highlights include everything had to be very clean, no cussing. You'll never hear a cuss word in an old school movie. No sex beyond some kissing, right? And all clothes staying on. You couldn't make fun of religion. Now, one fortunate thing that I did discover in this code is that protection of religion did go for all religions. It did not just go for Christianity, which at that time in America was much more prevalent. The not being able to make fun of religion covered all religions. You could not make fun of a religion. You couldn't show a safe being broken into, so that the idea was you wouldn't want to give criminals the idea of how to do something. You couldn't have blood. You couldn't show blood. So if you shot someone, that's okay. They fall down, right? But there's no blood. There's no explosion of coming out. You couldn't show smuggling. You couldn't show seduction. You couldn't show rape. You couldn't show, this is a good one, you couldn't show sex slavery or sex with children. Those are good rules. You couldn't talk about sex hygiene or sexually transmitted diseases, and you could not, in fact, show a scene of a childbirth. So some of these rules are actually really logical and good rules, and then some of them were kind of like, oh, that's kind of old-fashioned. So you couldn't say God, Lord, Jesus, or Christ in a movie unless you were actually, praying. So you couldn't use those words as a cuss word, and you couldn't even really substitute a word for them. Complete nudity, no nudity, never, no nudity. You couldn't even show anyone actually undressing. So at this time period, you might see a girl who maybe is playing a character who needs to change clothes. She'll go behind a screen, she'll pop her head up and talk to you, and then she gets back behind the screen and she's changing clothes, and then she comes out in something totally different. So you would never have seen someone undress. If you had dancing, the dancing had to be really clean. It could not represent any sort of sexualization. So a movie like Dirty Dancing, straight up not going to get made at this time. So that's the production code. So in your unit this time, you've got a choice of movies to look at. You've got Casablanca. Gosh, I don't remember what's on there. Anyway, go look at your thing. Choose which one you want to look at. I would suggest you go to IMDb and read the synopsis of each one of the movies so that you have a sense of which one you think might be the one you want to do. And then, watch it. And then all of the work that you have to do for this unit is, again, it's in D2L, it's in the content thread, it's also in the assignments thread over in D2L. So be sure you're submitting everything in the assignments thread in D2L in the Dropbox there. And I will see you later for lesson 3, which is the script.